The US even, they were paying Jizya to Morocco to protect their trade in the Mediterranean against pirates. That's crazy stuff.
The USA
That's
paid
crazy.
Jizya to Morocco.
People forget the immense power that the Muslims had. You have the siege of Baghdad. You know, the Mongols they've just conquered the Muslims. Some statistics, they killed 10 million people. You know, one of the greatest tragedies of this ummah, you know. It's really hard to see why the du'as of those people was not answered, why Allah allowed this city to fall and this tragedy to happen. But if you look at what happened after, I think you'll find something really amazing. The Muslims that struggled against the Portuguese in Brazil, there was 100,000 Muslims in Brazil.
The African slave who was actually a scholar.
The Mongols tried 6 invasions into India, but the Muslims, they stood strong each time. This Japanese man became Muslim in Malaysia, and he just starts steal and give to the poor. I don't know if I should be encouraging this, but it was a weird story.
We've actually been a lot worse. Like the last 100 years.
You know, you always theorize, why is it that we lost? Or why is it that the Muslims, they ended up, defeated? And a lot of it...
Just before we jump back into the podcast, I need to share something with you that's been weighing heavy on my heart for a few years. For years, you guys have asked me, is there a real way to make massive, passive wealth without touching riba? And truth be told, I didn't have a good answer for you. Most options available just seem like riba that's been rebranded as halal mortgages. And if the option is halal, then it's usually too risky, too scammy, or too slow. And then I came across Brother Sam Amin, who has $100 million of Muslim investor money invested in real estate. And this blew my mind. Here we have a guy who's helping people become multimillionaires through investing in real estate without riba. When I heard about it, I didn't jump on the opportunity straight away. I actually investigated it, and I observed the brother for over a year. I met his investors that have made millions on the back of investing with him. One of his investors actually is an uncle who had humble savings that now have compounded into $7 million plus, Allahumma barik, in just a few years. His deal structure is actually amazing. You enter into a joint venture with him and his team manage it 100%. Within 2 years, you're expected to receive a 50% return on your investment, Allahumma barik, and there's no haram. It honestly got really emotional for me because we now have a vehicle that doesn't compromise your deen, nor does it compromise your ambition. So that's why I felt compelled to share this good news with you. So look, if you're serious about wealth creation and you have at least $100,000 liquid ready to invest and deploy within 30 days, and you want your money to move, you want it to multiply without any haram, then Sam's newest development project here in Dubai might just be your ticket to generational wealth. Now, if this appeals to you, it's important that you know that over $5 million has already been committed to this fund. And this round is going to be closing very soon, inshallah. I've placed the link to apply to invest in his fund in the description of this video below. Alhamdulillah, this opportunity is real, and so is the window. With that said, let's get back into the podcast.
Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah, amma ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Guys, today I'm honored with our guest, Umar, the Orient. Assalamu alaikum.
How are you doing? It's very nice to sit here with you. You know, this is actually my first podcast, so I'm happiest that it was with you. You know, you always make me feel comfortable at home here. You know,
Barakallah feek. I appreciate them, and we discussed briefly, Akhi, about how important it is what you're doing. You know, in terms of the work that you're doing for the Ummah, history is something essential. It's a knowledge that even Allah Azza wa Jal, He didn't leave it out of the Qur'an. In fact, 1/3 of the Qur'an, one might say, is history, right? History of the prophets, the stories of the righteous people, the nations that were destroyed. There's so many lessons to be taken from there. And Allah says, in this there are ibar, there are lessons to be taken. So, if a man doesn't know where he's come from, he definitely is not going to know where he's going.
I think just this topic of why do we study history? Why are there lessons to be taken in the Quran from history? You know, it's, yes, you have on one side you have lessons, but the other side as well is you have an anchor for your identity. I think a lot of people, they get it's like, we humans, we need to have an identity somehow. And so people that don't study their history or aren't connected with their history, they find it in other things. They find it in nationalism. They find it in the West now you have sexual orientations and things like this. This is sort of where they're trying to find their identity. But for us as Muslims, our identity is connected with the Ummah. It's connected with all the people around the world. And the best way, I think, to feel that connection, to recognize that connection, is to recognize that your generation isn't alone. You're not the only generation. There have been, generation after generation after generation following the same path, following that same, that ideology, that lineage, that moving towards, all with the same goal of entering Jannah, inshallah, at the end of the day. And so history is like, it's essential, I think, for maintaining that identity. And it's actually, I'm already rambling, but I think for me, the thing that I like to do, that a lot of people that are interested in history don't do, is I like to focus on history that's not just the Arab history or the Middle Eastern history. I like to see all of it. I like to see the Muslims that were in Vietnam, the Muslims that were in China, the Muslims that were in Japan, the Muslims that, I even found historical evidence, like a revert from Korea back in, the 1600s, crazy stories, the Muslims that struggled against the Portuguese in Brazil. There was 100,000 Muslims in Brazil.
Were these the ones that were from West Africa origin?
Yeah, they were from West Africa. And there's so much history in these different parts of of the world that nobody pays attention to. We know, of course, we know the Umayyads and the Abbasids. We know Al-Andalus. That's kind of like the very edge of the common knowledge. Okay, there were Muslims in Spain.
Even the details there are not known.
That's fair enough, but at least it's recognized. Okay, Muslims have been there, for. It was some 800 years
but
or something.
But no one knows about the Islamic Sultanate of Vietnam.
Nobody knows about it. Was I can't remember the name of it. Champa. So Champa was this kingdom in Vietnam. It was a kingdom for 800 years in southern Vietnam. But the last 200 years of that kingdom's survival, it was actually a Muslim majority nation.
Wow.
And
when was it? What?
So it ended in the 1800s.
Okay.
So it's recent. Think of Vietnam. You have this sliver of a country, okay? And in the south, you had the land of Champa, which doesn't exist anymore. But the people of Champa, the Cham people, they still exist and they're still Muslim. And I'll get to that. But to the north, you had the Dai Viet, who are the modern Vietnamese. And there was a war between the two, a very long struggle. Eventually, of course, the Dai Viet, they managed to slowly, conquer the southern territory. And as that conquering was happening over, let's say, a few hundred years, 300-400 years, what I find interesting is that often when people are being conquered or when people are under immense pressure, they start looking for this identity. They start looking for an identity to bring them together, to give them strength.
Yep.
Same thing happened with the Caucasians when the Russians were encroaching, Chechens and Dagestanis. Same thing was happening in Vietnam, where you had these da'is, these traders and these people that were spreading Islam, these scholars from Malaysia, and they were bringing Islam up north, and they were communicating with these people who were under, intense pressure by the modern day Vietnamese, to the point where eventually the majority of that population, including many of its rulers, there was a dynasty of kings. I know the specific name of the specific person. It's a very long name, so I don't have it memorized. But I know who he is, and that he is the one that was the first to convert to Islam in his lineage, the king of Champa. And every king after him in the last 200 years of its existence remained Muslim. Even, man, I'm going to ramble here, even the neighboring country of Cambodia, they had one sultan. His Muslim name is Ibrahim the First. He was a Buddhist that converted to Islam, and his brothers tried to kill him for that.
Oh wow!
And eventually, they sold him out to those Dai Viets that were attacking the Muslims in Champa, and they sold him out to the point he died in prison.
Oh, wow.
in that Vietnam, that northern Vietnam area. And so, man, those Malaysians, they really did work.
You said something interesting here. You said the da'is, and then you said the traders, the merchants. And then it occurred to me that, you know what, when a lot of the stories about how Islam entered certain areas and locations in our history was on the back of trade. How important of a role did merchants and businessmen play in spreading Islam?
So this is actually one of the beautiful things about Islamic civilization, is that if you compare it, for example, with how the European powers, they spread Christianity, what they would do is they would go into a country and they would essentially, it was forced upon them. The same thing happened in the Philippines, same thing happened in South America, the same thing happened in, of course, Al-Andalus when it was retaken by the Christians. But the Muslims, it was a little bit different. There were conquests, no doubt. But the way that the Muslims dealt with the conquest was very different, and the way that they dealt with the locals was very different.
How so?
So what they would do is they would conquer a land, they would essentially take over the government. But they would leave the people intact, and that they were able to do or to carry on the religion as they wanted. You know, very famously, you know, it's often taught in universities that there were three places of harmony between what they call the Abrahamic religions. It was Al-Andalus, it was Jerusalem after Umar ibn Khattab conquered it, and it was Sarajevo and Bosnia under the Ottoman rule. These were the three lands that they say that Christians, Jews, and Muslims lived in harmony.
Okay.
And when it comes to trade, you see, I think that it actually starts with the great-grandfather of the Prophet ﷺ in something that Allah Himself takes credit for, which is رحلة الشتاء والصيف, which is it was this trade route that he had negotiated with the Emperor of Rome and the Emperor of Habasha, which is Ethiopia, where in the summer they would go to the north to Syria, which was under Roman control, and they would do trade there. And the negotiation part was that they would do it tax-free. They could enter with their caravans, and the Romans wouldn't tax them. And in the winter, they would go to the south, to Yemen, which is connected, of course, to Habasha. Essentially combining, or rather connecting, these two empires through the Arabian Peninsula, with the center of it being Mecca.
Wow.
Okay. And so,
if you are a practicing Muslim that's doing work that actually matters, then I want to host you on this podcast. You see, this ummah is in need of real men. Men who build, teach, solve, and lead. And they are amongst us. We just don't know their names yet. But this podcast was created to change that, to spotlight those whose work, wisdom, and story can benefit the ummah in real ways. So if you are someone who's making impact, leading with knowledge and skill, or you have a story that the Muslims need to hear, then I want to host you. So that includes students of Islamic knowledge, entrepreneurs, doctors, psychologists, authors, academics, and PhD holders. I need you guys. Charity and community workers, educators, journalists, relationship coaches, health and fitness coaches, personal development folks, or anyone that is doing great work. So if you are any of the above or anything like it, then I've got a form that I've placed below for you to fill out, and my team will go through that form, and hopefully we will showcase your experience, your wisdom, your story right here on this channel, on this podcast for the Muslims to hear. The Ummah is waiting. So let's bring the real ones forward with Allah's permission. With that said, let's get back into the podcast.
This created this sort of like, it centralized Mecca as a political and an economic hub in Arabia. And so when the Muslims eventually, they conquered Mecca, that influence, you know, economic and political influence goes a long way, even when it comes to getting people to listen to your religion. And so they were able to, the rest of Arabia essentially became Muslim. They followed, the leaders of Mecca at that time. And so when the Muslims, they went to these different places, they went to Al-Andalus, they made it into a trade hub between the Muslim world and the Europeans. When they went to Malta, they made it into a trade hub. When they went to Sicily, and they ruled over Sicily for 300 years, they made it into a trade hub. Palermo, the capital of Sicily, it was one of the richest cities at the time, when before it had been very poor and desolate, because the Romans, they didn't use it for trade. They used it for they used it basically as a military outpost for their navies.
Okay.
And so you have these Muslims, they're enriching these lands, and the interactions that they're having.
So when they would come, and for example, Sicily would be made into a trade hub.
Yeah.
Where was that trade going? Into Europe?
Okay, so this was like a connecting point between Europe and the Muslim world. Because, when you have trade, it mostly goes through the water, and Sicily is a giant island in the middle of the water that's, it becomes a port city, for refueling, for people of all these different countries to meet at this one place. And that's where the interactions happen. It's these interactions that, trade is something very, you find business partners, you make connections with them, you have relationships with them. And they see your character, they see the way that you deal with trade, the interaction upon interaction upon interaction. And so when the Muslims, they're economically and politically influential, when they have a lot of interaction with these different nations because of that trade, and it's not a military interaction, it's a type of interaction where both sides are winning, and they see the character of the Muslims. So these lands that were conquered, yes, but the people themselves were not, forced into any sort of conversion. It was the interactions over hundreds of years. People don't understand this. Hundreds of years. You know how long it took Egypt to become Muslim majority after Amr ibn As conquered it?
How long?
300 years for it to become Muslim majority. Same thing with Syria. You know how long it took the Indonesian islands to become Muslim?
How long?
800 years.
Wow.
People don't understand this. It's not like you conquer land that people become Muslim. It's interaction over hundreds of years and peacekeeping and safety and harmony, that only then will people come in with their hearts open, and education. But even that, the Jews, they educate their own children. The Christians, they educate their own children. It's not like we're going in and invading them and telling them not to use their own books. But trade is such a beautiful thing that it enriches people and enriches all, both sides. It's not supposed to be like one side is, taking advantage of the other. And so, yeah.
No, the reason why I'm really resonating with what you're saying here is because this is something that I was just pondering over a couple of days ago. I was in Mecca, went for a day and met with a good friend of mine, Ustad Yassin. He was telling me about how, he is currently in touch with some footballers and celebrities, big rappers from the UK. And this, if you look at this particular Ustad, he's got a very calm, collected personality. You wouldn't think of a sheikh hanging around with these guys, and if you did, maybe someone with a bit of energy, you might think of Uthman Farouk, for example, might be hanging around with these guys, but not Ustad Yassin. He's a very calm, collected guy. And a lot of the interactions were due to, questions around zakat. So these guys, obviously they're musicians, but they have their money in different places. They've got different investments, and they wanted to know how they should pay their zakat. And footballers likewise. And he became connected to them through, obviously there was an Islamic, engagement here. But the discussion was around business because they needed help to be able to deploy their zakat in a way that was correct. And they had to go to someone of Islamic knowledge to be able to do that. Then I started thinking and pondering in that discussion. I was like, subhanAllah, likewise, since we've entered this domain of entrepreneurship, it's opened the door for me to be able to have access to so many people that I wasn't able to access whilst I was giving da'wah for 10 years. Giving da'wah for 10 years, I had access to the youth, the drug dealers on the streets, the girls in the clubs. That was it.
Yeah.
But people that are actually, movers and shakers of society, that actually can, like if this one guy starts to practice, he employs 500 people. He can influence them overnight. right? Put a musalla in there and this, that. And, it just, these guys have more influence. They have more leverage. Not that I'm saying that we disregard people that are not in these positions. No, the da'wah is always there. But at the same time, you've got to be tactical. And the Prophet would reach out to both parts of society. And I realized, subhanAllah, I think the kind of Rolodex that I have that I can access to give da'wah to right now, it's just mind-blowing. Like the type of people that are there. Like if these guys come to Islam, they're already Muslim. But if they become committed to Islam over these long periods of time and interaction, the amount of influence that can just kind of trickle down to have is crazy. And I'm already starting to see it in that they will now also come to me and ask me questions about zakat. They will ask you questions about the deen, about salah, about the night prayer, fasting, and Ramadan. Oh, can we go to Umrah together? And we're starting to see, like, even, okay, we're going to start backbiting. Oh, is this permissible? Like, there was a beautiful story that happened the other day. One of my my partner, Abu Bakr, he's got a partnership in a supercar rental company. So one of his partners gave a deposit for a car that he wanted to purchase. I think it was like a Ferrari or something like that.
Yeah.
And the guy said to him, look, if you want to buy this, you've got to give me a deposit. Otherwise, I'm not going to hold it for you. He said, okay, I promise you, I will give you the deposit, but wait for me till tomorrow. I'll bring the money tomorrow. Now, the next day, what happened was that he had a change of heart and he's like, you know what, we found a better deal. I don't want to commit myself to this car. So let me just back out of the deal. So he spoke with the guy and he was upset. He said, look, you said you were going to give me 5,000 dirham as a deposit. And I held it for you. I mean, look, the guy didn't really incur any major loss. It was less than 24 hours. But this brother, he reached out and asked the question. He said, am I, and if you looked at him, you wouldn't even think this guy's practicing. So am I obliged to like follow through with this deal? Am I obliged to follow through with this deal because I said to him I'd give him the money tomorrow?
Even though it's not like a written contract.
Right? And then I said, look, there's a hadith of Prophet Bay'ani, to the two people that are engaged in the transaction, fil khiyar, it's up to them whether they want to back out the deal at any point, ma lam yatafarraqa, as long as the transaction hasn't happened and they haven't departed from each other. Right?
Okay.
It's called khiyar al-majlis. So I can even if I've given you this phone and you've given me money, before you leave, I can say, wait, give it back to me. Because we haven't departed from one another. So it was amazing that he wanted to ask the question. But then here's the other thing, right? There's this concept of ihsan, which is, bro, just give, even if I don't have to give you the money, I'll give it to you anyway, just to keep the peace and the relations of Islamic relations. This brother transferred the deposit to him regardless. So, you know what, I understand, but I'm going to give it to him anyway.
Even though he didn't end up taking the deal. It was just free money. He basically
gifted free money. Gifted free money. He's a brother. He didn't want to create toxicity amongst the brothers.
Yeah.
And I just found that beautiful. And what I'm trying to say is that these type of things are now starting to happen. These manners and Islamic etiquettes and creedal kind of developments occur at the upper echelon of society, it's going to trickle down and affect people all around them. So sorry, there was just 100%. It's just the thought that I had on the back of what you said. It just kind of hit me.
This is what you're describing now is exactly what happens in these Muslim lands, but now compound that over hundreds of years.
Wow.
That's what it is.
Yeah.
And even I'm thinking to myself, okay, why is it that it took Syria 300 years to become, let's say, Muslim majority? Because statistics are, they're estimates. And Indonesia, for example, 800 years. Well, I think the difference is that, because you mentioned something interesting about, people of influence. When you reach those people of influence, then they are able to share that same interaction, but with so many other people. With leverage. When the Muslims, they got into power through military warfare against other armies, and they took control of the government, then they are now the people with leverage. And they're able to have that sort of trickle-down effect. But the way that Islam spread in Indonesia, it started, and really there was pretty much no, there was no foreign invasions. There were wars, but they were internal to Indonesian groups and Indonesian islands amongst each other. It took hundreds of years for the first king to become Muslim. I think it was in a land in modern-day Aceh in Malaysia. Because in Malaysia, Indonesia is the same, it's archipelago. And soon after, he married his son to the daughter of the neighboring king. And I know the names of these places. I have them written. I know them. I made a whole video on kingdom by kingdom, year by year, what happened. And so this sort of intermarriage thing started happening. Sons were marrying daughters of other kingdoms, and they became Muslim, and they influenced the other kings. It kind of became like this domino effect of kingdom by kingdom, ruler by ruler, till essentially, most of the islands, till today, it's still happening. 20% of Indonesia is still not Muslim.
Yeah.
Bali, for example, is a Hindu majority. But this is how it happened, to the point because Vietnam is kind of on the edge of the archipelago. It spread to there. There was a Champa, a Cham rather, princess that was married to an Indonesian who then became Muslim. So her lineage became like it was this domino effect. And even in the Philippines is part of that. There was a period of time when I think there were 3 sultanates in the Philippines: the Sulu Sultanate, the Bangsamoro Sultanate, and there's a third one I forget. And so this is how it spreads. And I think that it's the conquest just kind of accelerated that process, but it's the same process. It kind of accelerated by like 500 years. That's all it did, And then even let's think about another land. Let's think about West Africa. West Africa, for the most part, except for there were some conquests by Dan Fodio later on in Nigeria. But let's not talk about Nigeria. Let's talk about more West Africa. Let's talk about Senegal, Mali, Mauritania, Ghana. There were huge kingdoms in these lands. The Ghanaian Empire, the Malian Empire, the Sokoto Empire, if I'm not mistaken. These were lands that were not conquered by Muslims, but it was because of the trade hubs that were built in Morocco and Algeria and Tunisia.
Wow, even the Sokoto Empire?
The Sokoto Empire, if I'm not mistaken, the Sokoto Empire, I might be mistaken on that. I can't remember if that was Dan Fodio or not. But regardless, let's focus on the Mali Empire was the big one. Mansa Musa is the famous one and everything. Yes. These guys were not conquered. Ghanaian Empire, Mali Empire, but rather they became Muslim because of that interaction with the traders that were coming from North Africa, from Tunisia, from Algeria, etc.
This makes a lot of sense because I actually always wondered about that part of the world, the Muslim world. How did Islam reach there? And you never hear about I never heard about any great conquests or wars, I always wondered, what's the big story? How did Islam end up there? But you're right. I guess what speaks to the benign nature of it was that it wasn't any epic battle necessarily. I'm sure there was things of that nature that happened, but primarily it was exposure to the Muslims.
Yeah, because
and trade and
exactly. I mean, this when the Muslims they took over the North Africa, they did what they always did best, which was that they built trade routes in the desert. They crossed the Sahara Desert and they started interacting. In a way that perhaps that level of interaction wasn't there before. And so with them they brought Islam, and just the same way as what had happened in Indonesia and Malaysia with traders crossing the seas to get there, you had these traders crossing the Sahara Desert, and so over time, in the same way that Malaysia had its first king that was Muslim, so did the Malian Empire, so did the Ghanaian Empire, right? And this actually led to sort of this butterfly effect where, because in the 1500s you had the European exploration, they went and they started colonizing places in the in the Americas, and they would bring slaves over from West Africa. This is a point that people don't really realize. Where did those slaves come from? Some of them, they came from more southern, like the Congo, and those were generally not. Those were, animist and things like that. But a lot of the slaves, they came from Senegal, they came from Ghana, they came from Mali, Mauritania, they came from Niger, of course, Nigeria as well. And so I've even seen statistics that show possibly up to 30% of those slaves that were taken, of the 12 million, 10 million actually made it, 2 million died on the boats. Really brutal circumstances. But 30%, 15 to 30%, let's say, of those, they were brought to the Americas. But what's even more interesting is that because of that Islamic education, because there was such a huge scholarly body in West Africa, people would send their students of knowledge from Syria and Egypt to Mauritania, to Mali, to Timbuktu, because of it was one of the great producers of Islamic scholars.
Wow.
And so you had scholars that were taken on these boats. You had people of immense knowledge that could read and write at a level that, even the slave owners often couldn't. They were more educated. And so they were employed in positions, not just as field workers, but they were often as secretaries, as, office workers and things like that, because you still have offices, back in the days. And so they were sent to these lands. There was a famous a case in the Sapelo Islands in Georgia where there was a plantation owner.
In Georgia.
In the U.S. He only exclusively purchased Muslim slaves because of their education.
Oh, wow.
And we even have documents that exist from one of his slaves called the Bilali document, where it was like 16 pages of a fiqh manuscript that he had memorized by heart in the Maliki madhab. Talking about different, issues of fiqh and law, dealing with, interacting with the slaves, amongst each other. So you have so many artifacts and manuscripts and evidences of these Muslims, even in the U.S. But my favorite one actually is, forget the U.S., because most of the slaves, they went to Brazil. I think 40% of the slaves ended up in Brazil.
Oh, not the U.S.?
No, the U.S. had very few slaves compared to the rest of the Americas.
Okay.
The big one was Brazil.
That was the Portuguese.
That was the Portuguese, right. You had slaves all over the Caribbean, Trinidad, Grenada, et cetera, et cetera. But it was Brazil that they had this huge body. I think 40% of all of the slaves that crossed the Atlantic went to Brazil. And so they ended up, the Muslims, because, when you take from one place, the shipping routes, they go into some specific cities. So when they were taking from Senegal and from Nigeria and sort of the more northern area of West Africa, they were generally shipping them to a place called Bahia. And the capital city of it was El Salvador in Brazil. And so you had this huge population of Muslim slaves concentrated in this one area. And they developed their own culture and everything, and they would wear specific clothes purposefully to signify that they were Muslims, because amongst the slaves they had become more like the higher class. Some of the freed slaves, they ended up having their own apartments, and they would use them as masjids, hide them, because they had to do things in secret. Friday prayers in people's apartments. It was this huge. Estimates show that there may have been 100,000 slaves in all of Brazil, Muslim slaves in all of Brazil. It was, and that's not a small number, considering the population at the time may have, of all of Brazil may have been, I'm going to guess 5-6 million or something, 10 million max. But what happened was the slaves, the reason why they're not there anymore, I know I've gone on a tangent, but I love this. I love this part of history. It was because they tried to gain their own freedom.
They died.
A lot of them died, yeah. There was a rebellion, it's called the Male Revolt, M-A-L-E. And they failed, essentially. They tried to seize the weapons, gain control of the weapons from certain fortresses, but there was a situation where the wife of one of the leaders of the rebellion, because she was angry at her husband, tipped off the authorities. And I can't imagine.
As a Muslim?
Yeah, Muslim.
Oh no.
Yeah, it was.
So she was a munafiqah. I mean,
as
in
Allah
potentially.
But yeah, that's.
So she basically did what Lut and Nuh's wives.
Very possibly, yeah.
Oh, no.
I know her husband for sure was Muslim. I assume the wife was Muslim. Allahu Alam.
So she basically.
Yeah. It was a betrayal.
Yeah, she betrayed the entire rebellion, huh?
Yeah, and we know her name even. We know who it was. It's just this stuff is recorded. This is not unknown to the history of Brazil. But yeah, what a tragedy. But even I'm reminded, because I wonder if they were encouraged to do the rebellion, because there was another Muslim rebellion that happened. It was led by a man named Dati Boukman.
Mhm.
The reason they called him Boukman is because anyone that was Muslim, they consider, the Europeans would call them people of the book, or Boukman.
Mm.
And he was from Haiti. And he led the only successful slave rebellion in recorded history, as far as I'm aware.
Okay.
Slave rebellions never succeed. But perhaps because that one slave rebellion against the French had succeeded only a few years earlier, maybe the Muslims, they felt encouraged, Real tragedy. And so the Muslims, they were rounded up. They were either forcefully converted, or they were sent back to Africa, or jailed, or killed. 100,000 gone. I don't want to leave that story off on a tragedy, but we can always move back to North America, where what I find really interesting, actually, is what happened after these slaves ended up in America, let's say USA. There was this situation very similar in the end of the 1900s, because the slave trade had ended, no more slaves were coming in, and when you're a slave, you can't really pass on your Islam to the next generation.
Mm-hmm.
Many of them were forcefully converted. The one circumstance, like the one case that I talked about in Sapelo Island in Georgia, where the guy, allowed Islam, he encouraged it. This is rare.
And that was due to his own benefit, right?
That was his own benefit, right? Generally, Muslims were forced to convert. I'll give you just one tangent. I know, I love these tangents. There was a guy, I think his name was Omar Said, scholar, Fulani scholar from West Africa. And he was forcefully converted to Christianity in the 1800s. I think it was 1852 or something. Or maybe it was the 1830s. And so for the longest time, his slave master thought that he was Christian. Until 30 years later, the slave master asked him to write the Lord's Prayer, which is a verse in the Bible, in the Arabic script, in Arabic. He asked him to translate it. And so he wrote something. And for the longest time, even, historians, they thought, okay, this is just, because on one side of the paper it says the Lord's Prayer written by the master, and the other side it says in Arabic. They thought that this was just translation.
Just translation, yeah.
Only recently, when scholars that actually speak Arabic read what he had written, they realized this was actually Surah Nasr.
Oh, wow.
إِذَا جَاءَ نَصْرُ اللَّهِ وَالْفَتْحُ. He had kept his Islam hidden even till his death, but he always remembered, he always kept the Qur'an in his heart, and he tricked them. We have two pictures of him, because it's the 1800s, there was cameras.
Oh.
We know what he looks like. I should say paintings, not pictures. Either. We know what he looks like. We have this document. It's in Washington, in one of the museums there. This stuff is not hidden. This is real stuff. But let's go back to the original point.
Why do you think he selected that surah specifically? What do you think he was trying to say?
This surah is really interesting because it talks about إِذَا جَاءَ نَصْرُ اللَّهِ وَالْفَتْحِ. When Allah's help comes, when His aid comes, when His victory comes, let's say, if I'm not translating it correctly. وَرَأَيْتَ النَّاسَ يَدْخُلُونَ فِي دِينِ اللَّهِ أَفْوَاجًا. You will see the people, they will come in like groups or waves to Islam, to the religion of Allah. This, I almost wonder, I can't say the prophecy, a'udhu billah, because he's not a prophet, but he predicted something that actually happened.
Oh, wow.
And I kind of want to get into that, because that's the next step.
Tafa'ul.
It was...
This is giving me chills.
Yeah, this is my favorite story, actually. This is one of my favorite stories. So let me tell you it. Because he predicted something that happened next. So Allah's victory came, but it came later. And in the 1900s, the Muslims, the last generation pretty much died out in the US. But even though slavery had ended in the US, you still had this immense oppression against the black people of America. You had the Jim Crow era, and you had the KKK was born in this era, late 1800s, early 1900s. It was like a 70-year period until, let's say, the 1940s, let's say. And you had, the black people of America suffering, and they're back to this issue of identity for strength. They're trying to find an identity for themselves. Who are they? They had their entire lineage, their entire history ripped from them. They're a people of no name in a land that they feel they don't belong in. And so they were looking back in their history, and they knew that they had some kind of connection with Islam, some kind of, even if they didn't know what Islam was, they had some of the traditions still. They say that there were certain foods or crackers that were eaten during Eid amongst, West African cultures, and they still had those things. They say that possibly, I've heard this theory, Allahu Alam if this is true, but, like blues and jazz music has a particular rhythm that may have come from, Quranic recitation originally, which then became, the slave songs, which then became, et cetera, et cetera. Allahu Alam if this is true, but these are theories that exist. And so they were looking for this connection. Some of these very bizarre groups started to emerge. First one you had, for example, was a fraternity. It was called the Moorish Science Temple, where the leader, he started claiming that, we must have descended from the Moroccans, who are Moors, who, they had this thing called Islam. And he started calling Chicago Mecca, and he wrote his own version of the Qur'an, A'udhu Billah. The point I'm trying to make, though, is that he was using this Islamic terminology, even though it had nothing to do with Islam.
Okay. What was his name?
His name was Noble Drew Ali. They call him Noble. That's his title, but I shouldn't be using that title. His name was Drew Ali. He changed his last name.
And the name of his temple?
It was called the Moorish Science Temple.
The Moorish Science Temple.
Moorish Science Temple. And then after him, there were all these other groups. The big one was called the Nation of Islam. Very famous.
Still around till today.
It's still around till today, but it's very, very small. It's only led by one. I'll get to that. Very weird story. And so it was brought about by this guy called
Muhammad Elisha.
He was the second one.
Oh, he was the second one?
He was the second one.
Oh,
it was brought about by a guy called Wallace Fard.
Okay.
Wallace Fard, we don't know anything about him, really.
Okay.
All we know is that he was preaching Islam in the street, or what he called Islam. We don't even know what it was. It could have been Orthodox. It could have even been the Ahmadiyya religion. It's possible he was half Indian. But we know that one of his followers performed a human sacrifice.
What?
Yeah. It was in New York and Chicago. Killed a man. And he was arrested and deported, for having connection with it. He was leading this group, and one of the followers was...
This Wallace guy?
Yeah. So Wallace was deported. Obviously, the guy that killed was in jail, Really weird. And so we had this sort of let's say 100 followers, not that many. And so Elijah Muhammad, he's the one that took the mantle next. And so he started claiming that Wallace Fard, he had disappeared in the same way that Isa had disappeared, according to the Christians. And that he was, A'udhu Billah, he was he was God himself, and that had come in the flesh, and that he had come and now he had left, and he had come to teach the black man that he was a superior race over all people, and that the white people, they were devils, invented in a laboratory 6,600 years ago by a mad scientist named Yaqub, and that, all sorts of things.
Crazy.
Nothing Islamic at all.
They still believe this till today?
I mean, they say that they believe it. I don't know if anyone actually believes it. I think it's just sort of a thing that they say.
But it's still something they try to hide?
Yeah. No, it's part of their teachings.
That there was
this is what they preach.
A mad scientist called Yaqub that made white people?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
They have depictions of him and everything, like pictures, he was, supposedly he had like a head that was like twice the size of a normal head and everything. Really bizarre ideology, but the point was that they were trying to find some kind of healing source or power for...
what happened? For everything that had happened.
Yeah, what had happened. Why is it that we're in this situation? Why are white people so horrible to us? And they actually brought a lot of interestingly enough, a lot of Islamic teachings. No pork, no smoking cigars. You have to pray, but of course they had a different way of praying. It wasn't like us. They had their own kind of version of fasting during what they called Ramadan, which was December. It wasn't actually. Long story short, the main character of this story arrives. His name is Mr. Little. Okay. Now, this is a man that you definitely know. But we're going to call him Mr. Little for now. And so Mr. Little, he was a gangster. Every type of crime you can imagine, he was involved in. He was a, like real gangster, pimping, drug dealing, everything. And he got arrested and he got put in jail. He had a prison sentence of 10 years. And during that time, his brother introduced him through letters to Elijah Muhammad. Eventually, when he got out of prison, he joined the Nation of Islam and became a preacher for them. And he became the main face for a long time of the Nation of Islam. And he even, he accelerated the Nation of Islam to heights so that even black celebrities were now getting involved. The most famous was Cassius Clay.
Muhammad Ali.
And that's the thing. So when you join the nation, it was encouraged that you change your name. So Muhammad Ali, yes, he was, when he took that name, he wasn't Muslim. He was part of the Nation of Islam. So he changed the name from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali. But Mr. Little, his first name was Malcolm, and he changed his last name to a single letter to represent the family that he never knew.
Oh, wow.
So he called himself Malcolm X. But eventually, Malcolm X had a falling out with Elijah Muhammad. There was scandals that Elijah Muhammad had been involved in. And he had actually been encouraged to join Islam. I think it was by an Egyptian imam in New York. And I think it was in February 1964. I hope I'm not getting that wrong. He became Muslim. He went to Hajj. He was amazed by this whole thing, that blacks and whites that could get along together, and that there wasn't any of this like racial superiority. They were all praying together in the same way, to the same Allah, same rituals, same wudu, same prayers, same clothing, everything. It was amazing to him. And so to undo all of that preaching that he had done over the last 10 years at the Nation of Islam, knowing that he was going to die, knowing that his people were going to kill him, he went back to the US and he started preaching Islam to the people. And within 11 months, he was Muslim for 11 months. They shot him and killed him. But that's not the end of the story. And it goes back. Remember, we were talking about إِذَا جَاءَ نَصْرُ اللَّهِ الْفَتْحُ. There's a victory to come. That this man, subhanAllah. You see, Elijah Muhammad, he had a son. And that son, his name was Warith. Warith, he had secretly been, semi-secretly, he was an open secret. He had been friends with Malcolm X, and he had actually converted to Islam from Malcolm X. And when Elijah Muhammad died 11 years later, after the assassination of Malcolm X, Warith took control of the nation. Now, let's say this nation is 100,000 people. Malcolm X brought a lot of people. He gathered all of the different ministers from all the different temples, and he converted them to Islam.
Oh, wow.
All of them except for one.
Wow.
All of them except for one.
There was Farrakhan?
That's Farrakhan. Farrakhan was even supposedly Muslim for 3 years.
Oh, wow.
And then he reverted back.
So they accepted Islam in droves.
Yes. وَرَأَيْتَ النَّاسَ يَدْخُلُونَ فِي دِينِ. They enter.
Wow.
يَدْخُلُونَ فِي دِينِ اللَّهِ أَفْوَاجًا. So,
wow.
I've tested this theory. There's a theory that in every black family in the US, there's at least one revert. And I remember I was in Philadelphia. I was on a bus, and there was an older, an auntie, let's say, and she was having trouble with her phone, or smartphone. She didn't know how to use it, and she asked me to do something. I said, okay. And I looked at her, I said, okay, I heard this theory that in every black family, there's at least one Muslim. She's clearly not Muslim. She said, yeah, my son became Muslim. I was like, okay, all right. There's some credence to this theory. I asked her, okay, so what about you? She said, her reasoning was that she didn't want to give up pork chops during Thanksgiving. you know.
Stop.
And by the way, we're in just as much need of guidance as anyone else. You know, may Allah guide her and us. But this is what happens. It's not just West Africa that became Muslim from this, from the trades that we're going back to. You know, you have this huge growing movement of Muslims in the Americas.
Being born in the house of Fir'aun, like Musa.
Yeah, you know, but who knows what's going to happen, because this growing underbelly of Muslims, they're really reaching out to influential people, and influential people, there's almost like this cycle that I've noticed, where it's the preaching. Of course, it starts with the poor or the lower end, the destitute, and this is the prophetic way. This is how it always happens. But eventually, like, it gets to businessmen,
it does.
We'll get to influential people, we'll get to rulers, and then when the ruler becomes Muslim, then the people, a lot of the time, many people that come in droves. Malcolm X was that influential person. He had brought 100,000 people to the Nation of Islam, and Warith became the leader. He was like a political leader for them. So when he became Muslim, they came in droves.
Oh, wow.
The same thing happened with the Turks. You know, there's so many different Turkic tribes. You know, the modern Turks of Turkey, they claim descent.
Before we go to the Turks, just on the issue of the United States.
Yeah.
So prior to the beginning of the podcast, we were talking about how when they were coming up with their laws and their constitution and everything, there was like an influence from Islamic law.
Yeah.
So tell us a bit about
that. Like, think about this. The US becomes a new nation in the 1700s. And it's trying to find a path for itself. And obviously, it doesn't want to go down the same path as the kingdoms and the empires before it. It's trying to build itself as something new. And of course, they're going to take the European influences, you know, the ideas that were spawned in the French Revolution and things like that, of a republic, et cetera, more seriously. But they sought knowledge from other places, including the great civilization, you know, throughout the last 1400 years, which is the Islamic civilization. And so, you know, you had Lincoln, for example.
How do they study? Did they like study Arabic, or did they like?
So I've heard, Allahu Alam, but they had translated mushafs, they had translated Qur'ans. It was something that, you know, when you're building a new nation, you're studying laws, you're studying the laws of the different lands. I've heard that some of the founding fathers may have studied Arabic. That is a very real possibility. They studied the Qur'an itself. They studied Islamic law to the point where even
founding fathers being Washington, Jefferson,
you know, I think
Franklin.
I mean, there's a lot of founding fathers. Like, I'm talking about, you know, like, you know, let's say that wrote the Declaration of Independence,
five, six guys.
Oh no, there's. I mean, sure. I mean, the big one, of course, is Washington. He had his own mushaf. It's on display in.
He had his own as well.
Yeah, well, his mushaf is on display in Washington.
So why did he have a mushaf? Like,
it was. I mean,
for those who may know, mushaf is a copy of is the Qur'an in book form.
I mean, to go back to the point that I was making about why did he have a mushaf? Is because it was his personal study mushaf. It was like you know, it was something that he was using for his studies. I've heard theories that he did study Arabic as well. I'm not like didn't fact check that or anything, but it's very possible. And even if he studied Arabic, it's probably just like a very, you know, rudimentary, you know, basic level to have some understanding. I don't believe for a second that he was like fluent or anything. I'm not trying to go in like the direction of, you know, aunties and their other WhatsApp chats, you know, making these theories. But Islam was really important to the point where they have murals in Washington, for example. If you look at the ceiling of the Library of Congress, you know, it mentions all of the great civilizations that have influenced the creation of the U.S. It mentions Judea, it mentions Rome, it mentions Greece. There's a bunch of them, just in a circle, surrounded by different, you know, images of angels and things like that. And one of those tags, clearly descriptive and equal to all the others. Of course, we don't see it as equal; we see it as above. But they have it written the word Islam.
Wow.
Islam, they consider it one of the great civilizations of this world. Great lawgivers. They have depictions of Suleiman al-Qanuni, which was the very famous sultan from the Ottoman Empire. You have to understand, like, there was real interaction between the U.S. in its early days, and even, for example, Morocco. Morocco is supposedly, Moroccans, they claim this, and I tend to believe them. I think it's true, in that they were the first country to recognize the U.S., because, it's an independent nation against, some of the rival empires in Europe. They're like, okay, we recognize this, no problem. And because and the U.S. even at a point that they were paying jizya to Morocco, a jizya tax, to protect their trade in the Mediterranean against the pirates that were ruling there. There was a sort of like there was a system of piracy in the Mediterranean, and so the U.S. had real interaction with Muslims. They had real respect for the Islamic civilization, the Islamic society and laws and everything. Back to the point of Islam in the Americas, it's not something new. Like, I think we're sort of like.
The fact that they were paying jizya is incredible.
That's crazy stuff.
The USA
That's
paid
crazy.
jizya to Morocco.
Like people got to remember where their roots are. People forget the immense power or the immense, strength and influence that the Muslims had. People really. This is one of the reasons why you need to understand where you've come from, your history, so you can solidify, you can understand your identity. You are not a poor people. You are not a people, that you're not a downtrodden people. You are a people of greatness. You are a people of light. You are a people of high stature.
Mm-hmm.
And people, they feel they've forgotten this.
What are some other interactions that the US has had with the Muslim world in its early stages?
This is
was there ever a situation where they tried to kind of get friendly with the Muslims, because obviously they'd just broken away from the British Empire, and Britain and Europe in general obviously has its issues with the Muslim world. Ottomans have, I'm not sure exactly at what point it was, but they had expanded into a lot of Eastern European countries that were Muslim. I can imagine that maybe it was like the enemy of my enemy is my friend type of situation.
I get what you're saying, but the issue it's just an issue of timing. I'll tell you, because the rise of the US came about at the fall of all of the major empires. There was kind of this the Dutch, the British, the French were in trouble. Like, of course, it was the late 1700s, but soon after, in the early 1900s, for example, the 1800s had lots of wars. Then the 1900s, you had the world wars. It was kind of this shift in power where both the Muslim civilizations and the European civilizations were starting their decline. And so the U.S. very quickly, because the U.S., you have to understand, there's an issue of rizq in land. Different lands, Allah gives them rizq more than others, and the U.S. has they have the greatest river system. They have the greatest protections that a nation could have. They have 2 oceans and a desert to the south. The U.S. can be really self-sustaining. The U.S. doesn't, and it's so far away from the old world that it doesn't need that sort of interaction. It was only sort of, from what I understand, in those early years where they were still kind of building themselves up, that they had some interactions with the Muslims. But this is sort of where the tide is starting to shift. And, I can even get into how the tide shifted. There's, you have to understand something. I truly believe that it's not up to people, or rather, I should rephrase this. The ability of a nation to succeed, really, there's an element of human effort, of course, But I think for the most part, like this is just, it's something that Allah chooses. Allah destines what nations rise and what nations fall.
He said that in the Qur'an, وَتِلْكَ الْأَيَّامُ نُدَاوِلُهَا بَيْنَ النَّاسِ. And like that, we alternate the days between the people, giving victory to some and defeat to others, and then switching it around.
Yeah. I mean, I fully, with faith, believe this. And even it's something that I've seen. Like if I think about how is it that the US rose, or how is it that Europe rose above, the Western powers, they rose above the Muslims. I always come back to Al-Andalus, actually.
Okay.
So Al-Andalus was very interesting because under the Muslims, as I mentioned, it was something that it became a very rich land through trade and through even the Muslims. They brought in these new technologies. They call it the Arab agricultural revolution. There were all these new water pumping technologies that the Arabs brought over to Al-Andalus, so that you could actually grow things like rice and all sorts of different crops that didn't exist before in Iberia. And Iberia is Spain and Portugal.
Okay.
Yeah. And so they really enriched this land. But the problem that I find a lot of you always theorize, why is it that we lost, or why is it that the Muslims, they ended up defeated. And a lot of the theory, they relate to how through that richness and through that wealth, they became arrogant in the land, and they became people of luxury over hard work. They became and actually they started fighting each other. There's a lot of infighting. Al-Andalus, eventually it split up into little tarifas, I think they're called. And the Christians, they would make the crusading powers, they would make agreements with some of them over other Muslims. So Muslims were siding against Muslims, and it was just kind of like this slow, gradual defeat until the entire thing eventually, slowly, one by one, each kingdom was collapsed. Now, the thing about that is that...
Interesting, Imam Qurtubi, rahimahullah, he mentioned he was actually present during the exodus of Muslims from Cordoba. So he actually witnessed the expulsion. And interestingly enough, and he's a great scholar, I'm not talking about the Mufassir, he was a student. This is Abu Abbas al-Qurtubi, who had the explanation of Sahih Muslim and things like that. In all of his works, he doesn't comment on the expulsion of Muslims from Cordoba except once, which is shocking, right? A person who's gone through such a monumental incident in his life that's affected him and his whole people and nation. You expect to see remnants of that through his pen. Like you expect to see that theme consistently, being that even Ibn Taymiyyah, you can see he's living with the Mongols are invading, these fatwa, there's a lot of in-life kind of interactions, real-life interactions with the world that he's living in his books. He only mentions it in one place. I think it was in his explanation of Sahih Muslim. He mentioned that the reason why we were expelled was because of sins. The people, they started indulging in sins.
Yeah.
And there's a hadith from Prophet, he mentioned some sins, and he said, if you do these things, Allah will place humility over you, and He will not remove it from you until you come back to your religion. So
it's very dangerous. Yeah. But even, I always think about the concept of Allah replacing people. I think of, the fall of Granada, the last stronghold of Islam in Al-Andalus. It essentially, in a very short time period, it coincided with the rise of Islam in Turkey.
Really?
I'm going to go back to Al-Andalus, but one small tangent here. This, the conquest of Istanbul, or Constantinople, the conquest of it, the capture of that Roman capital, it came in a very short period of time between it and the fall of Al-Andalus. And the Europeans themselves, they consider it to be a trade-off. They lost Istanbul, but they gained Granada. Of course, on our side, we lost Granada, but we gained Istanbul. So it's like there's a very real replacement that happened in real time. that that Allah gifted us something as a replacement for the other. But back to the original point, why is it, I always wonder, why is it that the Europeans, in a similar type of replacement, why is it that the Europeans eventually took over, or they overpowered the Muslims in terms of civilization, or in terms of military strength, let's say? Well, the thing is that Al-Andalus, when Muslims lost Al-Andalus, the Europeans, they then expelled all these different Muslims. And when you expel a people from your land, you devastate it. Imagine all of the farmland and the crops and the traders and everything. The economy is destroyed. They destroyed their own land. Really? with the expulsion, and they were in deep trouble because now the Muslims are not going to do trade with these people. And so they have no other way. Like neither can they produce nor can they bring things in. And so humanity is very interesting because they adapt. People adapt to the pressures, whether you're Muslim or not. This is a quality of humanity. And so what they were doing was they tried to find a way. Okay, the Muslims are blocking us with trade with the rest of the world. We're on the edge of the world. The Muslims are to the south, and within the European trade system, we're kind of like the very last, we're the very end. So it's, trade from, let's say, China or anywhere. It goes through all these other different nations, taxed and taxed and taxed and taxed until it gets to Iberia, to Spain and Portugal, through the mountains that border it and France. And so everything is already super expensive. Okay,
I know you're here for the podcast, but I need to share something that's been happening behind the scenes with you. So, being in the position that I'm in, I get exposed to a lot of opportunities that most people would live and die never be exposed to. I obviously can't make use of all these opportunities. And in those situations, it just makes sense to share it with you. There is a brother who's helping brothers who have zero business experience start making money online. Within 90 days, the overwhelming majority of his students will start making money. He's got a student that secured a $48,000 deal within just 60 days. His students are making $10K a month. This is ridiculous because he's literally taking guys from zero to hero with Allah's permission. Now, I'm sure you've heard these type of claims before. And so have I, which is why I didn't really buy it until my previous sales director, my head of sales, came to me and said, listen, bro, this guy's program is different. Like, people are making money. Like, people when they join this program are not saying I was inspired. They're not saying I was motivated. They're saying I made bread with Allah's permission. So naturally, I had to get in touch with him. And I asked him, I said, Akhi, how do you do it? And he said, the process is simple. I help Muslims become solopreneurs, where I get them to secure deals between brands and influencers. I show them how to structure the deal and make the cut in between. And I show them how to do it in a way that's halal. I have never seen someone whose program has got such a high success rate. And it makes sense. Why? Because this is not like a course that you're just going through. This is a hands-on mentorship. This is feedback loops. This is a very hands-on program. Now, with these things, there's always a catch. And the catch here is that it's very hard to get inside this program. They've had well over 10,000 applications and less than 2% have been considered. And more than 98% of those applications have been rejected. Now, I'd love to tell you that this is just like a scarcity tactic, but no, genuinely, they are so obsessive about the type of people that they let through because they want to make sure they safeguard their success rate. So they want to make sure that you're actually qualified for the program. So look, if you're ready to stop watching others win and actually start winning yourself, and you've been looking for that golden opportunity, you can apply to join Brother Abu Lahya's marketing influencer mentorship at the link below. It's real. And inshallah, it could be that break that you've been waiting for, man. With that said, let's get back into the podcast.
And so they were trying to they decided they're going to try and build these new ships. Because the technology at the time, there weren't ships that could go across the ocean. There were only ships they were called white water fleets. You can take a boat and you can go along the coast of the white waters. Yeah,
like a ferry.
Yeah, exactly. The technology for blue ocean navies. This was invented during the time of this like transition.
Oh, wow.
You know, the Crusaders, they invented this technology as a way so they could bypass the Ottoman Empire and they could go to all the different places. Remember, they were looking for India, they were looking for China, they were looking for these places to do trade with,
Wow.
rather than go through the Muslim lands. Right? They felt like they were surrounded.
Wow.
And so this technology developed, and technology, they had some battles with the Ottomans, and they defeated them. Because they had grown stronger. The Spanish and the Portuguese. First the Portuguese. They defeated the Ottomans.
Where did they fight them?
They were fighting them in places like the Ottomans. If I'm not mistaken, they had. So you have both in the Mediterranean Sea, the Red Sea, and also on the east coast of Arabia, in the Indian Ocean towards India. Okay. And so...
Oh, so the Ottomans, they had India?
Oh, the Ottomans... No, they didn't have India, but they had fleets in all these lands.
Yes, you're right. Sorry, I'm just thinking of Turkey.
Yeah.
They had... At their peak, they had expanded into...
Exactly. Yeah. Because, I mean, originally, like, let's say Egypt was ruled by the Mamluks. The Ottomans eventually took over Egypt. And when you take over Egypt, you take over the Red Sea, and you take over the Mediterranean Sea, all the way to Algeria. And then they were expanding into Arabia.
If you have like Iraq and Sham, then you got access to the Indian Ocean.
To the Indian Ocean, exactly. And so they had fleets there. You know. And so this kind of I think this is one of the main reasons why the Europeans, they started to have a hand over the Muslims, because they developed this technology that allowed them to travel to lands and to places in the water where the Muslims didn't have that. And so they began. That's how the exploration happened. And then soon the British got involved, and they were even better because their sailors, they sail in some of the roughest waters in the world.
I think also the Dutch. They really advanced.
They were very advanced because they took those technologies, but
they built on them.
But their sailors are on another breed, because the seas that surround the Netherlands and Britain and these places, they're untamed waters. They are the roughest. You know, when you go, you can't have a bad day; you're dead. And so that's why, you know, you had these select countries. They started to create empire. You know, you can defeat lands when you have navies that can just appear wherever they want and disappear. You know, if your navy can go in the blue water, but you're stuck to the coast, the white water, there's not much you can do. Technology is a real thing. Technological advancement. And so the Europeans, they managed to dominate that area. And of course, they end up colonizing the Americas. That brought them wealth beyond imagination. And then the U.S., perhaps the greatest piece of real estate on the planet. You know, perhaps aside from Bangladesh, it's the second most fertile land on the planet, around the Mississippi River. You know, incredible defenses, incredible ports. Like, even when you have a port, you know, on the water, you need like sort of like a chain of islands to break up the rough ocean water. So New York is one of the greatest ports on the planet because it has a series of islands that protects it. Allah gave rizq to this land that made them powerful when they took over these lands. And so Allah chooses, you know, who ends up victorious over the other. You know, there's since I'm rambling on.
But even that, just to mention that point, Allah will never oppress his people. If Allah took something away from the Muslims and gave it to someone else other than them, as you mentioned, it is due to a punishment. So ظهر الفساد في البر والبحر بما كسبت أيدي الناس. Corruption is spread in the land and the sea because of what your hands have caused. ما أصابك من سيئة فمن نفسك. Any harm that comes to you from yourself. Even the battle of Uhud, when the Muslims lost that battle, and they were with the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet almost died. Well, they thought he died. They said, how did this happen? The Sahaba were confused. Allah said, قُلْ هُوَ مِنْ عِنْدِ أَنفُسِكُمْ. It's from yourselves, because they disobeyed the Messenger ﷺ, the ones that were on the hill, and then they decided to come down the hill, and then basically expose the Muslims from the back. Point being is that if Allah Azza wa Jal gives something that the Muslims had to other than the Muslims,
Mhm.
it's due to a shortcoming on the side of the Muslims. And at the same time, even then, I love the point that you mentioned about how if Allah Azza wa Jal took, for example, caused us to lose Spain, gave us Turkey. Allah's wisdom is sublime, subhanAllah. So even if He's taking something away from us because of our sins, there is a divine wisdom. And there is a victory brewing elsewhere. There's something. Even the point that you mentioned about America, like even I'm thinking, subhanAllah, like the concept of Musa being born in the palace of Fir'aun. Like, did they take these Muslims from West Africa and cause them to be raised in the house of Fir'aun? And then what did Musa eventually do?
Yeah.
He learned from that civilization and the advancement of, like all the different sciences and everything inside the palace of Fir'aun, and then basically toppled it.
Yeah.
So who knows what Allah Azza wa Jal has in plan?
Wallahi, I'm with you 100%. And actually, this leads me on to that. But just before I get onto that track, I need to correct a statement that I made. Because I sometimes just, like a lot of people, I kind of get lost in the technological advancement. It is important, however, to recognize that there's a concept of barakah being, let's say that you have a goodness that you expect to come from an effort. When Allah puts barakah on something, it multiplies the goodness beyond what you can expect.
The ability to do more with less.
Exactly. And so, yes, I could say, okay, on paper, the Muslims, Khalid ibn Walid should not have been able to win the Battle of Yarmouk against the Romans. He should not have been able to win, the other Muslims, it wasn't Khalid ibn Walid, but the other Muslims should not have been able to win the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah against the Persians. There's like, that's actually probably the more important part.
Yeah.
And I think that even I sometimes I get lost and I forget, okay, actually, no, it's victory comes from Allah. It's not about the technology. I mean, I can see
trends.
I can see the trend. I can see how technology, I can see how Allah gave this technology to these people and put them in a situation where they, and essentially taught them how to make these things. But at the end of the day, this is from the will of Allah.
I love that you pulled yourself back there, because subhanAllah, so many times people, for example, get involved in a particular effort. It could be, for example, looking at history or entrepreneurship or science or technology or whatever have you. It's important to not divorce that from the creedal implications.
Yeah.
Because if a person has that strong aqeedah, the aqeedah is proper, which ultimately affects your actions. If your iman, ultimately, when we talk about aqeedah, we don't want to confuse people, but ultimately it's your iman, right? That solid, strong belief you have in Allah, the sincerity you have, the love that you have from the hope, the fear, the trust that you have in Allah, the khushu' that you have in your salah. All of this is these actions of the heart ultimately affect the actions of the limbs, and on the back of that, Allah rewards you with things that you could never have imagined. Like the Muslims in Medina literally had the crown jewels of the Persian Empire. Like ragtag Bedouins and farmers in Medina were now just enjoying the crown jewels of the Persian emperor. Right? Just a few years after the Prophet's death. So Allah Azza wa Jal, He rewards and He gives to His slaves based on the level of iman and khair that they have. At the same time, it's very important to put 100% effort into the means, because even the Sahaba, maybe technologically they weren't as advanced. Maybe they didn't necessarily have all the means that were there present, but you know what? They exhausted whatever they did have. And they never thought to not carry on advancing and learning and growing more. So you gotta have both, right? This is literally what tawakkul is. It's to tie the camel and trust. Place your trust in Allah. It's not you do this and then that. It's
it's not transactional.
You do them together. Right? I place my trust in Allah, and at the exact same time, I'm taking the means. Right.
But then when I say transactional, there is a mistake that some people fall into. Sometimes with me as well, where we take these steps, we make dua, and then we expect Allah in transaction to give us. But in reality, that's a very poor mentality, I think. We have to trust that, okay, we ask for something, even we ask for victory. We don't know, maybe the victory is actually not good for us. My favorite example of this, if I can ramble on with it, is actually it was the fact that we lost many of the battles to the Mongols. Okay, and my brothers are sitting over here going to laugh, but because all I do is talk about Mongols, it's my favorite topic. But think about this: you have the siege of Baghdad in what was it? It was like 1200s, I think, if I'm not, it was 1258 or something like that. And it's a devastating situation. You know, the Mongols they've just conquered the Muslims. You know, some statistics, they killed 10 million people, you know, crazy numbers. And they're here. And within 2 weeks or something like that, less than a month, they get in and they kill everybody. One of the greatest tragedies of this ummah, you know. It's really hard to see why the du'as of those people was not answered, and why Allah allowed this city to fall and this tragedy to happen. But if you look at what happened after, I think you'll find something really amazing. When the Mongols took over these lands, they took the traders and the governors and the doctors and the engineers and the craftsmen, and they started transferring them. They transported them and sent them all the way to China. Okay, now you have to understand the Mongol Empire. It completely took over China, what they call the Yuan dynasty, all the way to essentially Persia, and at the end was Baghdad, until the Muslims stopped them there. And they developed this class system in China, specifically in China, because that's actually where they made their headquarters. The Mongols, they made their headquarters in China. And it was a 4-class system where you had the Mongols at the top, the Semu people, which were the Muslims from Persia and from the east, from the west of them, as a second tier. And then you had the northern Chinese and then the southern Chinese. Okay. So they actually took the Muslims and they put them above the locals. Now, I'm not saying that this is a good thing, but let's see what happened next. So there were 11 provinces essentially in China. They divided it up into 11 provinces or states. I think it was 8 of them were directly ruled by Muslim governors.
Interesting.
And the other 3 were ruled by the Mongols directly, but they had Muslims as vice governors. And so the Muslims were put in very high positions. And from there, they began spreading the Dawah. Very famous was the governor of Yunnan, which is the most southern province of China. It's still a province till today. And the governor's name was, I think it was Sayyid Shamsuddin Omar or something like that, or Ajal Shamsuddin Omar, something like that. And he, because of his efforts, because of him and his son as well, you'll find there are Muslim majority towns, not villages, towns, in that province till today.
In China.
In Yunnan. To the point where, briefly, for 20 years, there was a Muslim sultanate that took over half of the province for 20 years in the 1800s. You know, it was real. They had a Muslim sultanate. It was called the Pingnan Sultanate. And or Pingnan Guo in the Chinese version. And that's just a testament to how many Muslims were there. And I'm just talking about one province. You have to understand. You have the Bible Belt in the US. They have a concept called the Qur'an Belt in China. And it covers 4 provinces. Yes. These are regions where Muslim influence is heavy.
Oh, wow.
And I'm not just, it includes the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, but it includes these actual Chinese people that converted to Islam. They're called the Hui Muslims, Hui. These are essentially Chinese in every way, except that they're Muslim. They don't eat pork, they don't, et cetera, et cetera. And it covers the provinces of Xinjiang, Qinghai. There's two others. I'm not going to bore you with the names. I forgot them. But just look up Quran belt. There's even a Wikipedia page. It's like it's well known.
Oh wow.
And I don't know if you know blogging theology, right?
No.
Blogging theology is this. He's a British Muslim. He has a YouTube channel and everything. I love his work.
Okay.
He always mentions this one particular poem. It's called the 100-character poem. Okay. It was written by the Hongwu Emperor. It was the first emperor that came after the Mongols were defeated. Mm-hmm. Right? You know, he managed to defeat the Mongols and kick them out of the country with the help of Muslims.
Oh wow.
He was surrounded by Muslim generals because remember they were put in high positions in the military, in the government, in engineering, etc., etc. And so because of that loyalty that that the Muslims had to him, and because of the love he had of the Muslims, he wrote this poem. It's called the 100-character eulogy, and it's all about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
What?
It's very famous.
Have you done a video on this?
I mentioned it in the video sometimes, but yeah, I gave a khutbah once and I kind of I mentioned it. It's such a fantastic thing. You know, some of the masjids, they actually engrave this poem on the entrances in China of their. You should see the masjids in China. Oh my goodness, you cannot imagine that this is a masjid. They look like these ancient Chinese temples, but they're masjids. And they have like, you know...
the architecture, basically.
The architecture, unbelievably beautiful. It's like, you know, wherever Islam goes, you know, it doesn't necessarily change... it doesn't change the language of the people or the culture. You know, the people are still... It doesn't erase anything from them. And so the Chinese people, they still have their Chinese culture. And, you know, some of the masjids, they double as schools, and in those schools they actually teach kung fu. I've seen videos of hijabis learning kung fu with spears and things like that in masjids in China. You know, there's a very, very famous kung fu master by the name of Wang Ziping, and he's considered like one of the greats of China, but nobody knows he's Muslim.
Oh wow!
You know, he was from the 1800s. And he, there's a whole story. And he learned Kung Fu partially from a Kung Fu master in a masjid. Because he was hiding in a masjid from, there was an invasion of China by the European powers. And he was involved in a rebellion. He went and he hid in a masjid. He lived there in secret. And there was a Kung Fu. Crazy stuff, man.
Wow.
Crazy stuff. And then...
What was his name?
Wang Ziping. So W-A-N-G is Wang. That's his last name. Ziping is Z-I...
Wang Ziping.
Z-I-P-I-N-G, something like that. Wikipedia page, we know what he looks like because you know, is late 1800s, early 1900s. No, actually, it was early 19. Yeah, he was in 1900s. So we have pictures of him. We have video of him. Oh. You know, in his 70s. Crazy stuff. And then the Japanese. Okay, here we go. The Japanese. They had this, you know, they felt the pressures of imperialism, right? They felt the European empires encroaching upon them and they were trying to invade them, and the U.S. strong-armed them into, you know, some unfair trade agreements and things like that. And the Japanese are like, okay, we got to join the Muslims. We got to join the Muslims to counteract or to fight against these encroaching imperial powers that were invading China, that were invading Korea, that were trying to invade Japan. And so they started like having, like creating some good relations with the Ottoman Empire. Okay. And so the Ottomans, they sent them a delegation of like 500 people in this giant warship. The warship crashed. It was one of the greatest naval tragedies ever. But what happened after that, I know I'm skipping over things, but the Japanese, they then sent 2 warships back with the remaining sailors, but they also sent Japanese people with them. And some of those Japanese converted to Islam. We know the name of some of them even. And they started teaching Japanese in the war academies in Istanbul. Like there was relationships happening. Right. See what I'm saying? And then the Japanese, they were also building relationships with the Muslims in Malaysia, and then the Muslims in China. because they can see that the Muslims in China, they're a huge minority. They say, some statistics say today that there's possibly, if let's say Saudi Arabia has 36 million people, there may be 38 million people, Muslim people in China.
Wow.
Like you have to understand, the Muslims are real in China. It's only until the very recently with the communist overtake that they kind of lost a lot of their power. But so the Japanese, they were like, they were trying to build relations with the Muslims after the fall of the Ottoman Empire in the early 1900s, and even the fall of the Qing dynasty in China, which was the last empire. There was this weird situation where you had, it was what we call the warlords area, the warlord period.
Mm-hmm.
And so you had these groups of warlords that would control different areas of China. One of them was called the Ma clique, M-A clique. Now Ma, you have to understand, Ma is short for Muhammad. This is real. This is not nonsense. Now I know Jack Ma. I looked up his name. I think his etymology is different. It's not Muhammad. He's not from Muslim lineage. But the Ma clique, and we have all the details about them. We have all of their pictures, all of their names. This is early 1900s. We know who they were, and it was 3 generations of Muslim generals that were heavily involved in that Qur'an belt that I was talking about. And so the Japanese, they're like, okay, the Ottomans just fell. What if we get an Ottoman prince? I forgot his name.
So this is after the Ottomans having fallen.
Yeah, because the Ottomans, they fell. Remember,
but they wanted to bring,
in 1915.
They wanted to kind of revive the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah,
on their doorstep.
Because they need something you have World War I in 1914, 1990.
Yeah.
Sorry, 1914 to 1919. Yeah. The Ottomans fell essentially during and after that war. That was their crumbling. But the Ottomans were still seen around the world as these are the people.
This is amazing. So you're telling me the Japanese still saw the honor and the strength in a fallen Muslim empire,
yes,
such that they wanted to help revive it on their doorstep.
Yes, because they were trying to have control. I'm not going to say this is for good reasons. It's all about power.
No, but it shows the izzah and the honor that Allah has placed in the Muslims, that even a fallen empire, they're looking at that you know what? I'd rather have a fallen empire here.
Yeah, and so they're
not
exactly. And so they already have all these Muslims there. They were really trying to use that Muslim Ummah power to counteract the imperial powers.
Mm-hmm.
And so they tried to there were a number of Muslim sultanates that arose in China. Most of them were in the Uyghur territories, and so that's kind of why China wants to keep a clamp on that in that territory. But even, man, there was this really weird situation where there was a British guy, William Sheldrake. I know his last name was Sheldrake. They call him the Pickle King because he was a British guy that became Muslim, but he had a pickle factory. So they call him the Uyghurs, they invited him to become king of their small republic. And so they called him the Pickle King. Very weird situation. It was a republic that only lasted a couple of years, but anyway. And he never made it. He by the time he got there, it already crumbled, but so yeah, the Japanese, there was this one particular Ottoman prince that they tried to install in power, just like those other sort of kingdoms that didn't really come to fruition. But you have to understand, the Japanese knew Islam very well, and they were very connected because of Malaysia, because of the Muslims in China. They had this whole thing in the early 1900s, before World War II, where they were trying to, they had this sort of council of Muslim development in Japan. I can't remember what the acronym was exactly, where they were building masjids, and they were encouraging scholarly work, not among the native Japanese, but among Muslims that would come there. Very famously, there was a Russian Muslim sheikh. He was ethnically Tatar by the name of Abdurrashid something, I can't remember his name, but he went to Japan. To escape the the communists that were the Bolshevik Revolution, everything. And he got involved with something called the Black Dragon Society, which was like the secret underground society that was involved in Japanese politics. And he started like teaching them about Islam. And he was, bro, there's crazy things. One of my favorite stories, man, I'm going on, but you have to appreciate this. There was one of the members of this Black Dragon Society who was very high, like this is a society that's it's like it's very well connected in the political sphere. You know, the president is or the prime minister. I don't think it exists anymore. This was like before World War II. There was this Japanese guy. He went with his family. They went and lived in Malaysia. I think this was to escape the draft in World War I or something like that. So this was a little bit before. But what happened was there was this situation where there was a bombing in China, and the Chinese, I can't remember exactly if it was a false flag or not. You know, I'm not getting into that sort of thing. But the point is that it caused tensions between the Chinese and the Japanese. Uh-huh. In Malaysia, there's a huge Chinese population. Okay. This man's sister, the Chinese knew she was Japanese. They kidnapped her and killed her and beheaded.
So whose sister?
This Japanese man. Just imagine there's a Japanese man living in Malaysia.
But he's not a Muslim.
He's not a Muslim yet.
Okay. He's not Muslim.
He's not Muslim yet.
Yeah.
He's going to come back to the Black Dragon Society. I'm getting somewhere.
Okay.
So a Japanese man, he goes with his family to Malaysia. They go to live there.
To escape the draft from the war?
Escape the draft, or, you know, maybe economic reasons. It's been a long time. I can't remember the story. And so the sister is killed by Chinese triads, mafia. Okay. Because of some event that happens in China, that between the Japanese and the Chinese, there's a bombing, there's tensions, etc.
They take revenge.
Yeah, basically, they take revenge.
It's a revenge.
It was a railway bombing, if anybody wants to look it up. And so this guy, you know, he eventually became Muslim in China. In Malaysia. This Japanese man became Muslim in Malaysia because of his friends, because of the surrounding, because of the interaction that we're talking about. And he just starts going on this Robin Hood type, steal from the Chinese triads and give to the poor.
Oh, wow.
And he had this gang of Malaysians. Like, I don't know if I should be encouraging this, but it was a weird story. And so the Japanese and the Black Dragon Society, which has a lot of spy networks, they start like, okay, there's this Japanese guy, this Muslim Japanese guy that's going around stealing from the rich and giving to the poor, stealing the rich Chinese triads. We got to get in contact with this guy. And so they do. By the way, there's a whole movie in Malaysia about his life. He's very well known in Malaysia. His last name was Tani, Tani. Forgot his first name. And so, you know, he becomes involved, and then they start to they use him in like all these different spy activities against the British, who are now coming in to conquer Malaysia. Crazy stuff. Oh, wow. But like the Japanese are very, you know, at the time they were very, very well acquainted with the Muslims, especially the Black Dragon Society, which is a very, very powerful society up in politics. I think they had some members that converted to Islam. If they weren't members and they were like tied to them, such as this Robin Hood guy, there was another one that went to India, but I forget the names because Japanese names are hard to remember.
The Mongols, they obviously had a massive impact on India. Ultimately, the Mughal Empire originated from the Mongols. What was that connection, that missing link?
So what happened was actually...
we heard about Aurangzeb and great Mughal
I know what you're talking about.
But how what was the link between the Mongol Empire and then these, the Mongol Empire and the Mughal?
It's a little bit interesting because the link isn't direct. Okay. However, I know the Mughal, obviously the name comes from Mongol. Yeah. What's interesting though is that...
So Mughal is the Indian version of Mongol, sorry.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Like the name, you know, I mean, I don't speak Hindi, but from what I understand, the etymology comes from Mongol.
Okay.
So the Mongols themselves, they never actually managed to invade India, and they tried. Mm-hmm. But there was a Muslim empire at the time. It was called the Sultanate of Delhi, or the Delhi Sultanate, mm-hmm. And they managed to they were there before the Mughals, and they were there before the Mongols, and they managed to defend the borders of India, I think 6 times Like the Mongols tried 6 invasions into India, but the Muslims they stood strong each time. And but what happened was that the Mongols there was this sort of civil war that happened. It's called the Tuluid Civil War.
Okay.
And the most fascinating, I'm going to get to, but just give me some time to give you a backstory. One of the grandsons of Genghis Khan, his name is Berke Khan. He actually converted to Islam in Samarkand. Have you heard of Berke Khan?
No.
Okay, so he was a grandson of Genghis Khan. He converted to Islam, and because of his conversion, as we've been talking about this whole time, a lot of the people under him became Muslim.
Yeah.
And he eventually took control of 1/4 of the Mongol Empire, because he had 4 quarters. He had the Ilkhanate in Persia, you had the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, you had the Golden Horde in the north, which he controlled, which is in Russia, and you had the Yuan dynasty, which is China. So he controlled that, and he began, as revenge for what happened in Baghdad, he attacked his own cousin in Persia, in the Ilkhanate.
And he wanted to do it as revenge?
As revenge to defend the Muslims. Can you imagine? Just think about this for a second. The grandson of Genghis Khan becomes Muslim and starts a civil war against the other Mongols to defend Islam.
And this is documented?
Yeah, he is one of the most famous. Bro, if you go to Turkey, man, people know this man. There's statues of this man because the Turks and the Mongols, they're very they have a lot of connections. If you go to Central Asia, everyone knows this man. Everyone knows him. I spoke with a Muslim revert from Mongolia once, and he told me, it's known, but they don't talk about it in their history books in school, because obviously it's not like a thing they're proud of. You have to understand, this is not, as I mentioned, this is not like WhatsApp chats. This is a real history. And you can even look up the name of the civil war. It's called the Tuluid Civil War, Toluid. And so eventually the Mongols, they broke up into 4 pieces. The empire collapsed, and 3 of those 4 pieces, not the Yuan dynasty, not the one in China, but the other 3 pieces, they eventually became Muslim because they're in Muslim lands. The interaction is there.
So 4 pieces, and 3 of them became Muslim.
3 of them became Muslim. And the first obviously was Berke Khan, but there's others. Uzbek Khan was in similar region. We know the names of these people, and we know who converted and who didn't, and whatever. And so from that, the Mughals of India arose. They originally came, I think. What was the brother? What was the first ruler's name? Baybars or something? Not Baybars. It was Babur. Babur, he descended from. They say he descended from the Mongols, but it was a very distant relationship. But he claimed their authority over the lands of Central Asia. Long story short, there was some political intrigue. I think his cousin or his uncle or something kicked him out of power. He ended up taking his army and going to modern day Sindh or Punjab or something like that, and established his rule there. Okay. And eventually that empire spread to Bangladesh,
So he's from Central Asia.
So he is originally from Central Asia. Yeah.
And he was the first Mughal king.
He was the first Mughal sultan, let's say. Yeah, king. And I think Aurangzeb was, he must have been the 6th or the 7th. And that was the height of the power. Aurangzeb was the big man.
So they were fully, these are not subcontinental people then?
No, they weren't. So the Indians, the modern political sphere in India often tries to paint them as foreign invaders, which to a certain degree, yes, they were. But you have to remember, the Muslims were in India long before the Mughals. Actually, the sad part, and there's a lot of sad things in history, is that in order for the Mughals to expand, they were actually fighting other Muslim empires. So they were fighting the Sultanate of Delhi. They were fighting the Sultanate of Bangladesh. They were fighting, it wasn't like, It's not like, okay, the Muslims are invading.
Just like what the Ottomans did, man. They had to. They destroyed the Mamluk Empire.
Yeah, they destroyed the Mamluks. Right. It's the reality of politics. Muslims have fought other Muslims.
Yeah.
And
Umayyad versus the Abbasid.
Right? The Abbasid revolution. It's just a reality of history, and I think it's something that we kind of gloss over.
Yeah.
I think we sometimes look at our own history and only see the good parts and only see the good intentions. But Muslims have made the same mistakes as every nation before them. Muslims have made the same mistakes.
There's a hadith, the Prophet said, تَتَّبِعَنَّ سَنَنَ مَنْ كَانَ قَبْلَكُمْ شِبْرًا بِشِبْرٍ. You will certainly follow the path of the nations that came before you, handspan by handspan.
I truly see that, in even, I don't know if there's a hadith or not, you can help me, but, the equating the scholars of today to the prophets of the past, where there are nations that killed their own prophets. Well, we in our past, we've killed our own scholars,
Yeah.
Of course, very famous scholars, I'm sure Ibn Hanbal and et cetera, they imprisoned them and they,
tortured them,
et cetera. Right.
Yeah.
So it's something
happens to today, unfortunately.
it's an unfortunate reality that we've always had these sort of, issues.
So, you since we're about to conclude, you brought this point very, very timely to the kind of question really I wanted to end the discussion on. So we've seen these great, we've seen a glimpse of the great rise that Muslims have experienced in all these different parts of the world. Also the falls we've discussed as well. Looking back in time, you can often kind of see what mistakes you made. So looking forward, you can rectify those. What do you think is the fundamental lesson that you've learned from your look at Muslim history that can help solve our biggest modern problems today as Muslims?
I think, I touched on this earlier in the podcast when I corrected myself. I think the biggest lesson that I've learned is that you can always find a reason for why something happened in terms of like a dunyawi perspective. You can always find, it's like the stock market, like the stock market goes up and the news says whatever reason they can think of why it happened. Stock market goes down, they make up a reason. We can always find a reason why the Muslims have fallen or why they've risen or why the Europeans have fallen or risen or the Chinese have fallen or risen. We can always find these reasons. But I think when we do that, we get lost in the details. We forget the true, real reason, which is that there's an issue related to our relationship with Allah. There's an issue of, when we have obedience to Allah, when we have a good relationship with our Lord, and He gives us victory over all odds. And I think sometimes it's important that, we as a people, we have to do our best to make sure that relationship is a good relationship, that we're not committing the sins of the past, that we're not committing the sins of, for example, the people of Andalus who were replaced. But yeah, I think that's the lesson, is that when you look at history, you need to be careful not to make the same mistakes as the past. And even when I say mistakes, I'm talking about sins. But also, we have a beautiful history. We have an incredible, incredible history. And this is a history that it touched every part of the globe. It touched every part of the globe. I'm telling you, stories
before
from China.
globalization.
Yeah, before. Bro, like one last thing before, like, can you imagine the Spanish, they call the Muslims Moors, right? They finally get rid of them from Spain and Portugal, and they kick them out. And then they start traveling the world. And the first man to circumnavigate the world, was Spanish, and he goes around to the other side of the American continent, and he arrives in the Philippines, and there he finds people, Muslims, and he thought that he had just gotten rid of them and traveled to a new land where no human had ever been before, or no, obviously there's humans there before, but no
travelers from
the travelers hadn't been there before, and he finds that Islam has already beaten them to the punch, and that's why they called them the Moros in the Philippines. They called them the Moros, it was the same word as the Moors. The Muslims in the Philippines and the Muslims in Al-Andalus were the same. They called them the same, and this was a shock. This was a shock.
Wow.
So you're talking about globalization. There are
is giving me
you have to understand.
chills, man.
The Islam even spread to the you have to understand that we have evidence of tribes, Aboriginal peoples
Australia.
in Australia. Yeah. They're not Muslim, but they pray to someone that they call Allah, or that the name may have come from Allah.
Monotheistic understanding, right? There's worship.
Allahu A'lam. Like, I haven't looked into it deeply, but there's very serious evidence that the Indonesians, who are very close to them, obviously, that they had interactions and that those tribes took from them.
And they would do sujood in the direction of the Qibla.
Yeah, right? I've heard of something like that. Yeah. So, it's something I want to do more research on. Like, when I do a story, I do research for that, and then so I have a lot of gaps in my knowledge that I need to fill out. But that's you're talking globalization. This is long before we were there. The Spanish, they were shocked. So subhanAllah. Like, that's the Muslim history.
And I love that we ended it on the greatness of Allah, because when you look at, for example, what's happening in the world right now, and what is seemingly a very weak position that the Muslims are in, one can start to feel overwhelmed and maybe even helpless. But it's not like we haven't been in situations that are worse. In fact, even if you look at Muslim countries who may be even like weak and still under like Western influence, like today, the situation about 60, 70 years ago was a lot worse. With, communism and, a lot of liberal or Western values that were fundamental just after World War II, and so on and so forth. The situation right now is actually a lot better. So whatever situation that we're in right now, we've been in a lot worse. So it's never a situation where we're helpless, but also just reminds you that Allah can change things like that. One of the biggest things that kind of really signified that to me was when this DeepSeek GPT came out, and it brought the American stock market to his knees in a matter of hours. And the guys were crypto traders, and they managed to basically come out with Sam Altman. He was asked in China, what if we want to create something like a chat GPT? He said, don't bother, we've done it. And then Allah Azza wa Jal, he brings something from somewhere else, right? It happens to be the country that poses the greatest threat to America right now. They bring out this GPT that brings everyone else to their knees. Remind me of the story of Dawood and Jalut. Young boy with a slingshot, man. Young boy with a slingshot takes out this terrifying, big, giant general leader of the opposition army, and then Allah makes him king. So this concept of وَتِلْكَ الْأَيَّامُ نُدَاوِلُهَا بَيْنَ النَّاسِ, it's constant. Even Abu Sufyan, when he asked Herakl Azim al-Rum, the Roman Byzantine emperor, about this Muhammad, and he asked him a bunch of things about him to verify whether he's a prophet or not. And one of the things he asked was that, does he win all of his battles? And he said, no, we win sometimes and he wins. Al-Harbu Sijal. Al-Harbu Sijal, that sometimes we win, sometimes they win. And he said, like that are the prophets. Like Allah hasn't, it's not the sunnah of Allah that they will win everything, that the Muslims will win everything. No. Because Allah takes martyrs when the Muslims lose. And sometimes the loss is the way that Allah
exports the seed of Islam somewhere else. Like
Yeah.
what you just said about America.
Yeah.
Maybe Muslims would have never gone to America. Maybe there would not have been Islam in America.
Or what happened in China.
Right? Or in China had it not been for that. Because the ones who died, inshallah, martyrs.
Sure.
Right? Inshallah, they're martyrs.
Yeah,
But
more
maybe these are the
acceptable.
hikam and the wisdoms of Allah. I think we'll just end on the ayah where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He said, وَعَدَ اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا مِنكُمْ وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ. Allah makes a promise to those who believe and do good deeds from amongst you. لَا يَسْتَخْلِفَنَّهُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ. That Allah will give them khilafah on the earth.
Mm.
وَلَا يُمَكِّنَنَّ لَهُمْ دِينَ لَهُمْ الَّذِي ارْتَضَى لَهُمْ. And Allah will make their religion that He has chosen for them firm on this earth. And then Allah says, subhanahu wa ta'ala, He will give them safety after fear. بَعْدِ خَوْفِهِمْ أَمْنًا. Allah will give them safety after fear. So Allah says, I'm going to give you khilaf, I'm going to make your deen firm, but I'm going to give you safety after fear. That's Allah's promise. But He places that promise on a condition from us. يَعْبُدُونَنِي. Worship me alone. لَا يُشْرِكُونَ بِي شَيْئًا. And don't worship anyone else besides me. Don't do any shirk. Not major, not minor. Not in any way, shape or form. Don't worship the penny or the pound, the dollar or the cent. Don't worship idols. Don't worship, false gods in terms of what we traditionally understand as false gods, or things that we start to worship and idealize, Women, some men worship women, status, whatever. Your worship, your heart, your servitude, your submission, your love, your humility should be for Allah and none but Him. And then Allah will always fulfill His promise. And I don't know, man, I feel...
That's a beautiful, that's a very powerful way of thinking. Like it's very necessary. People often get lost in worshipping of these, of the world, of the different things of the world.
And I think these ebbs and flows in history of Muslims having these peaks and troughs, it just actually gives so much optimism, because it's like, okay, I don't even think we're in a trough right now. We're probably in an ascension.
I agree with that.
Because one thing that I've looked at quite a lot, and I'm still in my study of the last 100 years, we've actually been a lot worse. Like the last 100 years, oh my gosh. Oh, whoa, yeah. Things are a lot better now than they were. In some respects, no, but in many respects, they're a lot better.
I have a very, very positive outlook for the near future. Like I'm a very optimistic person, about what's happening on the world.
I think what can accelerate that is just the quicker we come back to Allah and we turn back to Him, subhanahu wa ta'ala, the quicker we can see that hockey stick rise.
Yeah.
But Umar, man, I really love what you're doing, bro, and I hope that Allah Azza wa Jal will give you the strength and the persistence and the resilience to carry on and do what you're doing at skill, inshallah. Because history is something I remember 10 years ago, just looking, trying to find people like you. I didn't speak much in this podcast because I'm just so like, wow.
Yeah, I hope the rambling isn't,
No. It wasn't rambling. Like it was like genuine. Like wow, mashallah, tabarakallah. And I can imagine that someone listening from the African American background, just listening to this, was inspired. Someone from like a Chinese Muslim or Chinese revert listening, watching, was just inspired. Like wow, Moroccans definitely.
Moroccans.
They don't need much to get inspired. They don't need much. They're mashallah, they're proud people, mashallah, tabarakallah. But no doubt, these are things that they do, man, give energy to the soul, man, and I'd love for you to write some books, man. You're a great storyteller.
Maybe one day, step by step. I'm just trying to find my the stride here. But as I told you before, this started as a hobby, really. I know you're saying don't keep it as a hobby, but I expect that at some point, I'd love to write some books. Bro, there's so much history out there that needs to be told. There's so much that needs to be told. And so I'm doing my best.
But may Allah give you barakah, and may He give you tawfiq and strength. Ameen. Khair, with that said, you have a flight to catch, so we'll leave it here.
Jazakallah khair for having me. It's been great.
It was an honor. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik. Sorry. Guys, I'm going to put the links to Umar's YouTube channel and other stuff that he's doing below. So make sure you check him out, give him a follow, and engage with him and his work. And giving feedback how you found this podcast, because I know that feedback, when I get those messages, it always encourages me to go that extra mile as well. He hasn't uploaded for a couple of months.
you have no, I've quit this channel 4 times. I've been so sometimes you feel like, does it actually help? But every time, I meet people in person, they say, I love your content, things like that. Please keep going. And so then I pick it up and I keep going. So I've been encouraged. I think I need to start uploading again very soon.
Bro, just the 2 things that I took away from that thing with the African slave, who was actually a scholar, like
Omar Said.
Umar Said. He wrote the Surat al-Nasr.
Yeah.
And this story about how the Portuguese thought they just rid themselves of the Muslims, but found them again. But that gave me chills down my spine, bro. I'm taking that away. That's invigorated me.
Yeah.
I appreciate you, man.
Jazakallah khair.
Jazakallah khair. May Allah bless you, man. So with that said, guys, subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
I need to share something with you that changed everything for me. Last year was one of the hardest years of my life. My health was at an all-time low. I had constant fatigue, brain fog, massive weight gain. My marriage, it was the hardest year of my married life. My business, I had setback after setback. Even my salah was suffering due to the lack of khushu' and my seeking knowledge. I was in a terrible place until I sat down with the Muslim entrepreneur coach on this podcast, namely Brother Fawaz. And he made a bold claim. He said, I help Muslim entrepreneurs make 10x more money whilst working 4 times less, at the same time showing them how to thrive in their marriages, in their health, and in their religion. Truth be told, it was a bold claim. I wasn't entirely convinced, but what's a man to do when he's desperate? I needed a solution. So I joined his Live by Design mentorship. And I can swear to you by Allah, it changed everything for me with Allah's permission. I am now making more money than ever before. I am also working less. In fact, I work very few hours, but the Live by Design program has showed me how I can get a week's worth of work done in just a few hours every single day. I feel healthier than ever before. I'm turning up better than ever before. My family is happy with me. And my salah is back. And my seeking of knowledge is thriving with Allah's permission. And just to be clear, I'm not the only one. One of Fawaz's mentees on his program was making just 13K a month while struggling in his life. Just 6 months later is doing $500,000 a month. Allahumma barik. So here's the truth. If you're a Muslim entrepreneur that's making at least 100K every year, but you know that you're operating far from your actual potential and these other areas of your life that are very important are struggling, then Fawaz's Live by Design mentorship might just be the thing for you. But please be warned, it's not easy, nor is it cheap. But if you're ready to live a life that you design with Allah's permission, then check out the link below in the description of this video. This is the program that changed my life with Allah's permission. And it might just change yours as well, inshallah.